Hello, I'm Alan Gerstel.
And I'm Laurel Sauer. Thanks for joining us for Heritage, a series of exciting local programming originally produced by our partners at the Education Network.
Now, our last program featured a look back at the beginnings of the Palm Beach County School District during its centennial year, 2009.
Well, tonight we pick up the story at the end of World War II, when thousands of servicemen and women chose to move to Florida to raise their families.
The decades that followed were often turbulent. The Vietnam War, segregation, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., President Kennedy, and his brother Bobby, those were just some of the events faced by parents, teachers, and students.
But there were some good times too. The campus shop near the school on the hill, the hut, and of course this popular safety patrol trips to Washington are some that come to mind.
So let's revisit it all as we bring you part 2 of Palm Beach County Schools, celebrating 100 years of excellence. World War II marked a turning point in the growth of Palm Beach County, and in turn, the county school district. The war effort mobilized the economy, which had been languishing since the Great Depression in the early 1930s. And once the war was over, Florida welcomed an influx of newcomers, former soldiers who had been here during the war.
To a large extent, the boom that struck Florida in the 50s can directly be linked to the people coming down here to train. There were tens of thousands of people who trained all across Florida. Palm Beach International was Morrison Field. The Boca Raton Army Airfield, half of it became Florida Atlantic University, half of it became the Boca Airport. Camp Murphy became Jonathan Dickinson State Park up in southern Martin County. There were prisoner of war camps for Germans in Clewiston and Belglade. The Breakers was a military hospital.
Servicemen also trained at the Naval Air Station in Broward, in Miami, and on bases across North Florida.
The men who came here saw paradise. This was so different from Minnesota in the middle of winter, you know. They remembered that when they came back from war. And if they didn't move here right after the war to set up a business or bring their families, they came here after their retirement.
And if they needed a nudge, developers ran ads in the northern newspapers to lure the former servicemen south. When World War II began, Florida was home to 2 million people. By 1950, it grew to 3 million, and by 1970, 7 million people called Florida home. To keep up with the demand spurred by the surge in population, the school district built 27 new schools in the 1950s, mostly along the coast. But that would soon change.
There was a fellow named Perini. He was an entrepreneur and real estate developer from Boston. And he came down here and he wanted to, at the time he owned the Boston Braves, which later became the Milwaukee Braves and later the Atlanta Braves. And he came down here and he built that whole westward expansion. We're now talking about the 60s. He built the baseball stadium with the city of West Palm Beach. The auditorium went in. And that whole movement, if you follow Palm Beach Lakes, how it makes that big curve west of downtown, that was where all that development went in. It can be directly linked to Mr. Perini.
And as people began to move into the new communities to the west, schools were built to accommodate the growth. But the population growth spawned questions that had to be answered by the Space and Time Utilization Committee.
This was when they had 5 members of the school board, so I was appointed onto that, and I was the chairman. And we were studying the size of a high school, whether it should be 2,500 students or 5,000 students, how many is too many. Should you have full-time schools? Obviously the school year was to accommodate the farmers when they needed their kids to work in the fields.
But since agriculture wasn't as important by the mid-1960s, the committee recommended full-time schools that didn't take a break for the fall harvest.
I look at the school system like a business and industry. And the beginning product is a child, and the ending product is a graduate of high school. Then he has to accomplish certain things, and I felt it should be run like a business to achieve that end, and that would best be done by a very competent manager.
John Adair established an engineering company in 1958, which became Adair and Brady in 1965. His company's imprint can be seen in as many as 40 schools across the district. Many of those buildings are still in use today. With the influx of people into South Florida in the 1940s and 50s, the state's population became bottom-heavy, yet the political power remained in North Florida due to districting. There were no universities south of Gainesville, and a feeble attempt to build a college in Tampa and call it the University of South Florida was met with derision.
The people in South Florida, the real South Florida, became so infuriated that said that's the last straw. And they said, we want a college in the southern half of Florida. And there were some businessmen in the Boca Raton area, some very courageous and driven business people who pushed and pushed and pushed to get a college. And so the first college south of Tampa was Florida Atlantic University. But when FAU broke ground in the 60s, this was huge, a real four-year college right here in South Florida. And it was a tremendous boon to Palm Beach County to have a real four-year college. The President of the United States, President Johnson, came down to dedicate it. So it was quite a big deal.
The current chairman of the school board is a product of the Palm Beach County school system. Bill Graham has fond memories that date back to elementary school.
I attended Barton Elementary for 2 years and had the pleasure of being on the safety patrol. And one of the greatest things that happens to elementary school students when they get to their more senior time in those schools is our famous Washington, D.C. safety patrol trip. And I was able to go on that trip in 1961. And the head honcho, we called him, of the tours at that time was a gentleman named Ed Easy, who was principal of Green Acres Elementary.
Ed Easy went on to become the president of Palm Beach Community College, the first junior college in Florida, and its greatest cheerleader. He oversaw the growth of its Lake Worth campus, as well as the expansion of campuses to Belle Glade, Boca Raton, and Palm Beach Gardens. Palm Beach Community College is noted as a springboard for some well-known actors who trained with the now legendary Watson B. Duncan.
He was my freshman English teacher. But of course, you know, it's against the rules for teachers to date students. So he was also he was head of the dorm. He lived there on campus. So there was a guy in there that I dated, and we would double date and just got to know each other. And that was one reason I stopped going to school at that time.
Among his students, Mr. Duncan motivated and trained actors Monty Markham and Burt Reynolds.
He couldn't play football. He'd been injured in an accident. He couldn't use his scholarship at FSU, so he decided to pick up some credit hours while he was recovering. And my husband told him he was having readings for a play and he'd like for him to try out. And he said, "Oh no, I'm not interested in that kind of thing. I couldn't do that." And so that afternoon at the readings, right before the time was up for, here strolls Bert, and he reads, and he always says, I read, "The dog chased the cat." And he said, and your husband said, "You've got the part." So after they were in rehearsal for a few weeks, my husband told Bert, "You're going to be an actor." And he says, "You're a nice man, Mr. Duncan, but you're crazy as hell."
Mrs. Duncan says her late husband was very proud of his celebrity students, who kept in touch with their mentor until he passed away in 1991. Even as the school district was being created in 1909, the focal point for education in Palm Beach County was the School on the Hill. The Central School was the first to open at Hibiscus and Georgia Streets, west of downtown West Palm Beach that same year. Central Junior High was built in 1915, just south of the Central School building. And in 1922, Palm Beach High School was constructed on the north side of the elementary school building.
This was the first major high school built in the county. And if you look at these buildings today, they're dwarfed by the construction that's downtown. But back then, this was a very important structure, not just for the school, but for the community. It represented something that this was a permanent community. This was not just a winter playground. This was a major investment for the county to make and to attract people to move to the area to live and to raise a family and start a business and all that.
Palm Beach High was one of only, I think, 5 schools, high schools in Palm Beach County. There was Lake Worth, and there was Delray, Pahokee, and Belle Glade. There was nothing north of here. Jupiter High had not come in yet, and of course none of the Riviera Beach. Everybody came here.
The former congressman graduated in 1949. He remembers going to the campus shop every day for lunch, and sometimes again after school. The campus shop was just across the street from the school. It provided a refuge from the school cafeteria food, which was not held in high esteem.
The campus shop was a shop across the street from Palm Beach High, and people went in there for snacks and sodas and stuff like that. And it was run by a family. And of course, the people that went to high school in the 50s and 40s would tell you that your school day wasn't over till you went across the street to get a soda from the campus shop.
We would go to the beach. We would pick up teams and play football on the beach almost every weekend. The hut, though, was the magnet. If you didn't go to the hut after a dance, you obviously didn't have a date.
The hut was a place over around where Phillips Point is now. And there's a very famous picture that ran in the Saturday Evening Post that showed kids standing out in front of the hut in their big old gigantic cars, which is, of course, what they had at the time. Burt Reynolds talked about growing up. Of course, he went to Palm Beach High, and going to the hut. And the cars would all just pile in there, and if there was somebody in the front and he had to get out, 10 cars had to move to get him out. And that was the place you were. On a Friday or Saturday night, you weren't anywhere unless you were at the hut.
The school on the hill, with its ancillary structures like the vocational educational building and the auditorium, eventually encompassed 2 entire city blocks, from Tamarind Avenue on the west to Georgia Avenue on the east, and from Gardenia Street to the north, south to Iris Street. Greg Rice and his brother John graduated Palm Beach High School in 1969.
A lot has changed in Palm Beach County since the time I roamed this campus, trying to change classes in 5 minutes, going from down the hill, up the hill. That's another thing that a lot of people like to remind me of. And I thank God I had a lot of good friends back then, because this is a big campus. This was a huge campus, and when you're just 3 feet tall, it's even bigger. So our buddies used to pick us up and set us on their shoulders and carry us up the hill or up the stairs or whatever, because back then there was no elevators, or certainly was no air conditioning in these old buildings.
Earl Stewart is a 1958 graduate who calls his time at Palm Beach High School a simple, happy time of life and a different world entirely.
I compare it to Happy Days, the TV series. It was, I think maybe one of the reasons why, I love that TV series so much. It was almost like Palm Beach High School. I mean, it was, everybody was, they were young and innocent and happy, and it was a time of life we never really appreciated. We took it all for granted. I guess probably different maybe also because we had, a lot of the people that went to Palm Beach High School also went to elementary school there and also went to junior high school, so their whole preschool lives, or whole up until college, was spent on one location.
Tom Mills, the Palm Beach County School Superintendent from 1978 until 1991, taught science at Central Junior High School. He also coached football.
It was just a very pleasant experience being a first-year teacher. I just loved my students, and being a young man, they really liked me, and so I had just a pleasant experience. It was easy to teach then. It wasn't as difficult as it is now. And we had very supportive parents who were active in the school. So it was quite interesting.
It shows how people can adapt and feel good about anything. I mean, we can look back and realize, what a terrible thing we were doing. I mean, we were, the black people lived on the west side of the railroad tracks. I mean, it almost sounds cliche today, but they did. And they, and they had their own theaters, they had their own restaurants, they had their own water fountains and bathrooms. I mean, it was it sounds so absurd in 2009 to believe that it existed, and it existed, and people didn't feel guilty about it.
In the West Palm Beach area, blacks couldn't attend the all-white Palm Beach High School. They went to the all-black Industrial High School. But during the late 1950s and 60s, the calls for desegregation were growing.
You can't talk about desegregation in Florida, and by that I don't mean just the schools, I mean everything. You can't talk about the civil rights issue in Florida without talking about a fellow named Leroy Collins. When Leroy Collins died, I believe it was 1999, he was in his 80s, the state legislature stopped in mid-sentence and without discussion unanimously passed a resolution declaring Leroy Collins the Floridian of the century.
Leroy Collins earned that accolade for the steps he took as governor in the 1950s.
He went to the business leaders of Florida and he said, folks, integration is a Mack truck and we have two options. We can stand in front of it or we can get out of the way, but it's coming. Florida's primary business, other than citrus and farming, is tourism, and it was even then. It was huge. Tourism depends on image. If people in the North and the Midwest turn on their TVs and see Florida policemen knocking down black people with fire hoses, you can forget about tourism in Florida for 25 years. And of course, he turned out to be quite prescient because did anybody take a vacation in Alabama or Mississippi from around the 60s on? It took them decades to get back, to recover from the terrible, terrible image of blacks being mistreated on national television.
Integration came to Palm Beach County schools in fits and starts beginning in 1961, when just 5 black students attended all-white schools. That token act was the result of lawsuits filed by African-American attorney William Holland as early as 1956, after he tried to enroll his son in an all-white school.
We had many leaders in Palm Beach County who provided for a peaceful transition, or relatively peaceful. One of the great ones was an African-American lawyer named Bill Holland, who, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, tried to enroll his son in a previously all-white school. And it wound up in litigation, and at the end of that litigation, which was very protracted, our schools were eventually integrated.
The school district's administrative center was renamed the Fulton Holland Educational Services Center in 1996, in honor of William Holland and Robert Fulton, a school superintendent in the 1960s who championed integration from inside the system. Though integration was ordered by the courts, many parents protested the rulings by keeping their kids home. A former school administrator says the district was not prepared for integration, and teachers and staff were not trained to deal with the backlash it would unleash.
Well, it was tough here. I mean, there were threats of violence, and there was some violence, a lot of violence during that period of time. I remember the superintendent had a bomb put in his car and it fell out on the street and things like that. So we had our very, very difficult time during the integration. But through the years and a lot of hard work by the employees, we kind of brought it together.
Palm Beach High School was one of the schools that allowed a limited number of black students to enroll in the mid to late 1960s. But it was also the site of controversy and protest.
Sitting out there on the wall in the morning, I remember vivid memories of right after Martin Luther King was killed, of a lot of racial tension, and there was groups of kids that came from the other high school that came down here. They were angry. A leader that represented that community had been killed. His life had been shortened, and so there was a lot of anger. And there was fights that would occur right out in front of the school out there.
In the fall of 1970, Palm Beach High School ceased to exist. It was combined with the formerly all-black Roosevelt High School and renamed Twin Lakes High School at the same location on the hill. On July 9, 1973, a district court judge ruled the Palm Beach County School District was fully integrated.
It wasn't without its scars, but Florida clearly, when you think back on all the southern states, Florida was the one that integrated with the least amount of problems, and it saved our tourism industry.
Tom Mills became assistant principal at Twin Lakes, and in 1978, became the superintendent of schools.
The first appointed superintendent was Dr. Joseph Carroll, and he came in to a political mess, and we were going through integration at that time, and I think he really helped us turn the corner, and what he did, I built upon that. So I think that was an important period in transition from a very highly political situation to having good school governance.
When Tom Mills became superintendent, Palm Beach County had about 80 schools. When he retired 13 years later, that number had risen to almost 120, all due to the massive growth in our population.
Yeah, we were successful in passing a school bond issue for $317 million, and we built quite a few schools. When I first became superintendent, almost all of our high schools were on double sessions, and over the years I was able to get them all off double sessions and get the schools back to a normal functioning type of environment.
Under Mr. Mills, the school district sent teams to universities to recruit quality teachers and revamp the instructional programs to create a unified curriculum. The district hierarchy was also altered so that the position of school superintendent was appointed rather than elected by a nonpartisan school board. Voters were asked to approve a $317 million bond issue in 1986, and they did.
We built over 30 new schools in this county with that bond issue and did some renovations and additions to others, but the focus was on creating capacity.
An increase of a half penny in the county's sales tax early in the 21st century also helped spread the network of schools.
All the problems that we've had back then, you have now, and you have to constantly find new ways of dealing with the problems. And there are new problems now that we didn't have back then. We have many children coming in who have language problems, and we didn't have that back then. It was just almost a single type of culture here. Now you have a very diverse culture, and that poses all kinds of problems.
In fact, just a little over 40% of the student population is white, 28% is black, and 23% is Hispanic, with the Hispanic population continuing to grow at a rapid rate. So as the school district looks ahead to its next centennial, the curriculum is being adapted to reach out to the broad spectrum of students who now call Palm Beach County home.
I always felt that I got an excellent education there. And I think most of the people who went to college, I don't know of any of them who flunked out because of intellect. They may have flunked out for financial reasons or boredom or something. But we really, all of us got a great education there.
Coming back here now and seeing that this part of the history of Palm Beach County has been preserved is very rewarding. I mean, I know all history is local, and there's so many people that live in the area now that weren't in the area back then. They've moved here from some distant places or whatever. But for us old-timers, the people that grew up here in West Palm, campuses like this, they're important because they represent our youth.
When I got older, it used to make me so angry when people from the north came down and said, "Oh, our schools are so much better than yours. Your kids don't know anything here," and that always angered me because I felt that I was well educated, but you only get the education you want anyway, even in today's world. If you're not interested, you're not going to get an education.
It really shows not only the successes of the school district, but the enormous number of changes that have been brought to this place that we call Palm Beach County. So both from a historical and a cultural and an achievement perspective, it's really an awesome moment in time to be here and be a part of it. And I suspect that in years to come, we will stand as a moment in time when some really good things were happening for students.
That's our nostalgic look back at the Palm Beach County School District celebrating 100 years of achievements. And once again, we'd like to thank everyone who shared their memories with us and with you, our viewers at home.
That's right, Alan. We hope you enjoyed both parts of this school centennial program, and we hope you'll join us again for future episodes of Heritage. For WXEL, I'm Laurel Sauer.
And I'm Alan Gerstel. We'll see you again next time.